Well, my name is Scott Kamen. My firm is Kamen Tall Architects, and we are primarily preservation architects engaged in working in either historic structures, new structures, but mostly anything that has to do with the exterior envelope of the building. We deal almost exclusively in these matters with board of directors and managers of those buildings, and our information is often transcribed and or represented at meetings that don't always include us. Our information becomes very complex on projects, especially when the numbers are beginning to run high and the budgets are high, and the decision path becomes extremely critical. And if the architect isn't working transparently with the board, almost directly and in a way that educates the board as to why those decisions are being made, it can often be felt that money's being spent unnecessarily, when in fact those expenditures could be curtailing much bigger expenditures down the road and in the future. Because the typical board problems that we're seeing today are deferred maintenance, not really understanding how to establish a budget for an exterior envelope of a building. When we see boiler budgets and hot water heaters, they're all budgeted for. And yet the largest expense that a building will ever see has no intelligent budget ascribed to it at all. And this is often because the architect's been introduced to the building once a very serious problem is already underway and something was noticed. By the time something's noticed, it's usually deeply affecting the building. So we come up with numbers and figures that are astonishing to the board, but they don't really understand where they're coming from. So I think the most important thing is that the board trusts its professional, that they have a very direct relationship with the professional, and that they're not asking for a lot of people to intercede between the board and the architect in the decision-making process. And if they do ask a professional to intercede, it has to be a seasoned person that knows how to work with an architect and how they're dealing with the problems that they're dealing with and setting up the appropriate paths for those problems to be resolved, whether it's phasing very expensive projects over a long period of time or biting the bullet and dealing with the problems all up front. But again, it's based largely on the same kind of relationship that one would have with a doctor or an attorney or any other professional. There has to be a platform of trust, and there has to be constant communication between the two parties, unfettered by interfering professionals or professionals that are coming from different places in the industry. I think the best example of how the path could turn roughly into a very circuitous, confusing path is that once the architectural information is delivered, reactions are beginning to happen. And the reactions may not always be worked out with the architect. So for example, now it becomes perhaps a huge monetary issue for the co-op because they didn't make the planning to deal with facades, and they have years of deferred maintenance, or the city's upgraded its rules on terracotta as it has, and now all sorts of repairs are needed that weren't contemplated down the road. So typical decisions that would go awry would start with the low bidder, which is almost by the very nature the unqualified bidder. Unrealistic time frames for how fast the work can proceed, rush, 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 but actually a lot of these projects need to be phased over years depending on the co-op's budget and their ability to do the work and how the work affects the culture of the building. Interference is a huge part of the problems that the architects run into. Either the neighbors won't allow the work to move swiftly, or the board is using a less experienced person to try to keep prices down, which usually ends up inflating prices in a hidden way, actually. There are many misdirections that are taken as a result of hearing the diagnosis, understanding this is going to cost a lot of money, and then blocking further professional planning and what are we going to do about this, and the client begins to move on his or her own without further developing the architectural relationship and how this can be budgeted, how this can be designed to fit our needs, whether that means we spend $100 over 10 years or $1 million in the first year. All these decisions are actually design decisions, and they affect the way the drawings are done, the way the bids are done. But the architect has to stay in close contact with the board and a back and forth so that as those decisions are being made, they're applicable to the standards of the building industry and best spent dollars. Once we're at the table with the board and we issue the information and the board discovers that it has a substantial amount of work to do, especially if they haven't done work in a long time, it's quite common that I will come up with a budget number that they never even guessed would be a cost for them. The number could be hundreds of thousands more than they were planning on spending. The best board question is to ask the architect, how can we do this work? How can we make this project viable? That is the essential work of the architect. We rarely have a client that says, go ahead, do everything, we have plenty of money in the coffers. Our job is to phase the project in such a way that it can meet the requirements of human safety, FISP, the New York City DOB, and still meet the budgets that the co-op or condominium can afford to spend on the building. And sometimes projects go for 10 years as a result, but there's always a way to work out a project. And buildings are never, ever left to become more and more unsafe because there's no money. It's just not a viable solution in Manhattan or New York City. So we do work on making the projects viable with whatever budgets can be produced. So I encourage the board to ask that one question of the architect, because that's the primary role of the architect, to make the project happen.